Folks, let's bring on Thomas DiLorenzo. Let's welcome him on. Thomas DiLorenzo is a free market economist, author of the upcoming book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And Thomas, thanks for being with us.
Please be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, oh yeah, pleasure. Well, the Democrats just released this Inflation Reduction Act, and I know you're a bit critical of it, but you have some good analysis on it. Let's start off by talking about what this really is. This is really about inflation. Like, how much is it spending versus how much is it actually going to save? What are we seeing with it?
Well, it's hundreds of billions of dollars of additional spending will increase demand in the economy. At the same time, they're raising taxes and imposing hundreds of additional regulations, especially on energy. And so the combination of increased demand in the economy and decreased supply is going to cause prices to go up, not down. So it has nothing to do with fighting inflation. It's a very cynical uh, thing that they're doing by calling it the Inflation Reduction Act when they have to know that that will only increase inflation. But as I said, if I said elsewhere, it's basically the Green New Deal in disguise, sort of a Trojan horse. In the Green New Deal, I'm sure you know, the author of it was the former chief of staff of the congresswoman who calls herself AOC. And he once said that it has nothing to do really with environmentalism, but it's an attempt to essentially destroy American capitalism and adopt some form of socialism and central planning. And they're doing it step by step by step. And this is the latest step in the so called Green New Deal. And I don't think the Soviets even were so bold as to propose this much central planning of their economy that is in the so called Green New Deal.
Well, that's a pretty strong statement. This has more central planning than even what the Soviets would do. Could you explain that?
Well, if you read the details about what they're talking about, one of their pipe dreams or sort of wish list items is to knock down all the buildings and cities and rebuild them in a greener way, more energy efficient way. And that sounds crazy, but it's in there. It's in black and white. It's written down in there in the wish list of the Green New Deal. And they basically want to do away with fossil fuels altogether and the internal combustion engine. That's just as crazy. And there's no discussion at all of how this will be so disastrous to especially the poorest of the poor people in the world when they do this. So the same people who claim to have championed the poor, the socialists, for millennia, have no concern whatsoever of how this will affect the poor. And that's a real giveaway of what they're really all about is power and totalitarianism.
Yeah, well, I was reading some of the proposal in it, and they are talking about like managing even things in your own home. For example, if you have like a gas stove, they give you benefits to replace your gas stove, and so in the very real sense, they do want to take some steps to like retrofit homes or destroy homes, just like you were saying with the Green New Deal.
Right.
On this note, let's talk briefly about central planning because I think a lot of people are like, oh, what's wrong with central planning? Like, what would you tell people with this?
Well, everywhere it's been tried, anywhere in the world in the last century, it's been a disaster. It doesn't work because for an economy to work, it requires a lot of knowledge in the minds of millions of people, all the market participants, the buyers, the sellers, the entrepreneurs, and they all have very detailed, decentralized knowledge of the jobs that we all do. We all do those jobs and we make money at them, and then we spend money that we make on things that other people specialize in. And no group of government planners could possibly imitate or possess the knowledge required to do the simplest thing, like make a pizza. I used to tell my classes, I was an economics professor for 41 years, and I used to tell my introductory classes it would be impossible for those of us in this room to make a pizza from scratch. Because, first of all, you have to start with a wheat farm, really scratch. And so just think of all the knowledge of running a wheat farm and a tomato farm and everything else to produce a simple pizza. No group of politicians could ever perceive that. And also, what how we make our decisions in the free market in terms of how to produce things is guided by prices. And you have to have prices that are determined by supply and demand by buyers and sellers. And you can only have that in a private property society. You cannot have that under socialism where the government claims to own property and just randomly and arbitrarily sets prices. That creates chaos. And we've seen it over and over and over again. The latest sad disaster is Venezuela, that went full blown socialism about 10 or 15 years ago. And it was used to be one of the most prosperous parts of Latin America. They're said to have more oil than Saudi Arabia. And you read stories now about people who used to have good middle class jobs searching for food in dumpsters and shooting zoo animals for meat. It's a horrible tragedy, and we certainly would not want to repeat that in America.
Yeah, well, on the note of central planning, I mean, really, it's a type of government control over everything, over the markets, that ignores kind of what you're saying is kind of the wisdom from the ground, so to speak.
Yes.
And one of the reasons, I mean, look at the Soviet Union. They might mandate, it's just kind of a example like you were using. They might mandate a certain number of production of pizzas every year, but through central planning, they might restrict one of the key parts, like in the supply chain, that makes that impossible to reach. Or they might have a one size fits all plan on the entire economy, that, for example, mandates certain things that doesn't take into account differences within each region. One of the clearest examples we have right now, for example, is like, regulations on fertilizer and soil. Whereas farmers know that different types of soil and even temperatures and rain and everything will basically change the amount of fertilizer you need. You cannot have a standard one size fits all thing, or you're going to mess up the soil. Same thing with centralized planning. One size fits all. It ignores the nuances that you run into on the ground. You know,
That's a
when
great
we talk,
example.
yeah, but when we talk also about the supply chains, though. I know you were really talking. Reading some of your stuff, you were kind of warning about how this is going to affect supply chains. This new bill the Democrats are trying to push right now. How will this affect supply chains?
Well, they want to impose higher taxes on corporations and especially small businesses. And anything you tax, you get less of. So if you're going to impose taxes on small businesses and large businesses, you're going to get less supply, you're going to get less production. And when you get less production, you get more unemployment. And that, of course, will cause the government to spend even more money on unemployment insurance and welfare and things like that. And so when you impose higher taxes, and of course, the Green New Deal regulations are all very costly to comply with, if not just in money either, and that businesses have to spend inordinate amounts of time complying with government regulations rather than producing their products and their services and managing their businesses. And so that all will cause the effect of reduced supply in the economy, and that will put even further upward pressure on prices. And at that point, the government will probably start talking about doing another disastrous thing, and that would be price controls. And when they put price controls on anything, what happens is people want more of it if it's cheaper temporarily because of the government mandated a lower price. But at the same time, it's not as profitable to produce as much. So you increase the amount people want, and at the same time, you reduce the supply available, and you have shortages. And black markets will become more prevalent, and a lot of people will just have to do without. And as I said earlier, it's usually the poorest of the poor who are harmed the worst whenever there's a situation like that.
Yeah, in Panama, for my viewers, you might remember we had a local on talking about the protests there. Actually, they just agreed on price controls. Basically, the unions agreed with it, made an agreement with the government, and they put all kinds of price controls in place. I think more than like 70 of them, including on a lot of food, oil, all kinds of stuff. And so, people down there were warning basically that, just as you're mentioning, Thomas, they were warning that this is going to be worse than what's happening in like Netherlands, because it's going to have the same effect on everything in terms of food and the availability of food. And it was kind of seen as almost like people talking about the food crisis, almost like another type of restriction on it in the guise of something allowing more of it. You think if it's cheaper, it's easier to get, but the market doesn't work that way, you know.
That's right. What'll happen is they'll put price controls on a product, and then that'll create shortages. So it will fail. It'll be a miserable failure, and they'll say, "Well, we have to do something." So they'll put more price controls on the ingredients to the product or the
Yeah.
inputs into the production of the product, and to hopefully reduce the cost of producing the product and getting more on the market. But that will cause shortages of that thing, of the ingredients or the input into the product, and it just snowballs and makes it worse and worse and worse until you get full blown totalitarian socialism with government control of all prices of everything. So it might start out just with the price of milk and the price of bread, but it inevitably will snowball into a lot more than that.
And so you see this Inflation Reduction Act is kind of bad on the surface, but very likely going to snowball into that kind of scenario. Could you explain how you see this developing with that?
Well, everything, not everything, but a lot depends on whether or not it can be rescinded in the next couple of years with a different government. But yes, what's going to happen with the explosion in spending is more inflation, more price inflation, and it won't necessarily be uniform. It'll create bubbles in different parts of the economy, like it always does. But the other half of it is the supply restrictions that are caused by all the government regulations that will be added in the under the guise of the new Green Deal, okay, and the tax increases. And so that's going to be a big negative for the U.S. economy unless something happens. I'm not that thrilled about the prospect of the Republicans taking over because they tend to sit on their hands a lot and they never undo the bad things that the Democrats do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
President Trump did some good things with deregulation and tax cuts, and look what happened. We had a booming economy for a while, but he didn't go nearly far enough, in my view. And so, all is not lost, in other words, even if this bill passes.
Now, in terms of the contents of the bill, it doesn't it, even Bernie Sanders, funny enough, was criticizing it, saying it's not really an inflation reduction bill. I mean, but I mean, I was surprised by that because Bernie Sanders, as a socialist, I don't think even tries to hide it these days. But this looks like a socialist wish list. I mean, is this a socialist wish list? What do you how do you view this?
Oh, yes, I think I've been referring to the Democrats as the demo Bolsheviks for the past several years because the party was taken over by socialists. The mask is off. They're socialists. They're not liberals. They're not progressives. They always have been socialists. And the mask is off now. And I think they were shocked into making this their Hail Mary pass by the election of Donald Trump. The election of Donald Trump and Brexit in England and the sort of the populist movements around the world, I think, shocked the elitists who run the governments into the fact that, well, the people might have a say after all. And look what they just did. They just elected Donald Trump. And so after all of that, I think they're looking at this as their last chance to impose full blown socialism, their the lifelong ambition of people, not just like Bernie Sanders, but Hillary Clinton and the other gang, Obama and the rest. And so this is their desperation pass, and hopefully it'll be a fumble.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that because AOC and a lot of others were actually criticizing Biden. And I mean, funny enough, they're arguing that basically Biden's policies are failing. They're arguing that he's losing at the polls, that he's losing voters. But rather than saying that he should kind of walk back his policies, they believe he should take it further. And they believed he needs to move forward with the Green New Deal. And that was a lot of the criticism. And it looks like this is, for the Democrats, kind of that, basically. It looks like this is what that is kind of meant to be for them. Like you're mentioning, really like a Hail Mary for the elections, that this is like their last
Hmm.
chance or last attempt kind of to do something they think that their voters would actually want. But do you think their voters would actually want this? I mean, that's the big question.
Well, not really. They have who are the voters? I mean, the voters are of the Democrat Party. Their voters. Many millions of them were fake in the in the 20 in the last
Yeah,
presidential
let's be
election.
real here. Yeah.
I'm convinced there were bots, so to speak. And so, certainly they've dumped on the working class. They've done away with the whole facade that the working class is the part of the Democrat Party. Government unions, yeah, they're still a big part of the Democrat Party, but the private sector unions not so much. They're under attack. Look at what they've done to the people in the energy industry and the
Yeah.
oil industry, especially the unionized labor there, by cutting off oil exploration everywhere they can. And so, yeah, I think this is their Hail Mary pass. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was massive vote fraud again in November.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't put it at 100% that the Republicans will take over Congress because of that in November. And even if they did, like I said, uh, they tend to sit on their hands a lot and not get much done. And so I'm not that optimistic about what can happen. We need to decentralize. We need to take power away from the center, away from Washington, D.C. And we do have a movement of that in America, with the massive migration of people away from places like California and New York and moving to Florida, Texas, the Carolinas. It's sort of a soft secession that's going on where people are moving away from the
Hmm.
bigger government socialist places like California and toward a little more freedom. They're voting with their feet, and we need a lot more of that.
I mean, yeah, well, it makes sense, right? It's a fake economic bailout for fake voters, right? So,
Yes, yes.
but but one thing I found interesting in it was even if we talk about it as reducing inflation, less than half of the budget was actually for that. Most of the budget was actually about climate change. And it really is, you were kind of calling it, it's really just the Green New Deal in disguise in the truest sense of the word. But when it comes to the climate politics, really they're using climate change as again kind of a vehicle for a lot of socialist politics. Can you talk about kind of this from like the economic standpoint of what these Green New Deal type policies really are? Because they claim to be about global warming or whatever they call it these days, but really, as you mentioned, it seems to be more about socialism and socialist economics.
Yeah, right. In the 1970s and into the 80s, they were warning about a new ice age. They said pollution is blocking the sun. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars a year for decades to reduce pollution. And as a result, more of the sunlight gets in. And they started saying, well, no, no, we don't need socialism to do away with a new ice age. We need socialism to fight global warming. But always the solution was we need to destroy capitalism and adopt socialism. But in the 70s, it was because there's a new ice age. Then in the beginning of the 80s, that's global warming. And that didn't work out either. We didn't totally destroy American capitalism. And so then they started talking about climate change. And so when climate, we need to avoid the climate changing at all. And of course, we need socialism to do that. And we're not going to call it socialism, though. We're going to call it the Green New Deal. Now, in a talk I gave not too long ago about this, I quoted the economist named Robert Heilbroner, the late Robert Heilbroner. He was a lifelong socialist, kind of a well known economist. And after the worldwide collapse of socialism in the Soviet Empire in the late 80s and early 90s, he published a mea culpa in the New Yorker magazine. I believe it was October of 1990, where he said, yes, the great battle between capitalism and socialism is over. But then at the end of this long article, he said, but there's hope. We can reconstruct socialism in the name of saving the planet from capitalism. And then he said, but it will take socialism to do this. And I call these people watermelons because they're
I, I,
green on the
I was
outside
gonna say.
and red on the inside.
Yeah, no, the watermelon movement. Yeah, red on the
Yes,
outside, green on the outside, red on the inside.
that's right. That's who they are.
So talking about this Green New Deal type program that's really just the basis of this whole Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, what specifically would you say in here is socialist, or is it more the central planning overall? Like, if you were to tell people like prove it's socialism, what would you tell them?
Well, as I explain in a chapter in my new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics, socialism is basically the forceful imposition of one government plan to supersede all of the individual plans that individuals make for their lives and for themselves. And the so called Green New Deal is a very comprehensive government plan to be superimposed on everybody and using the coercive powers of government to enforce it. And that, I suspect, is why these same people are now proposing, as a part of this bill, to hire almost 90,000 more IRS agents and to
Yeah,
arm 70,000 of them with automatic weapons. What on earth could that be about other than forcing people to comply with their wishes, whatever their wishes may be? And their wishes, I think, are not just going to be restricted to tax collection. They already have some 70,000 IRS agents to collect taxes, and they did a very good job of it last year, collecting record taxes. So they don't need even one more IRS agent to collect taxes. So these new 90,000 that they're talking about have to be involved in something else, and it's totally totalitarian. I've been reading that the Cuban Americans in Miami are especially outraged over what
yeah.
happened to President Trump's house and this because it reminds them so much of Fidel Castro, at least the older Cubans anyway, who are still around, who have fled Cuba in the early '60s.
Briefly too, I've talked about the IRS and basically that it's unconstitutional in my opinion, and that they had to amend the Constitution even for income tax. Could you talk about like kind of the basically the history of that a little bit? Because I know that people, of course, are kind of used to this now, this type of tax system, income tax, and the nature of the IRS itself. But the IRS is a relatively new branch of the government, and they seem to be expanding it. I mean, can you talk a bit about this?
Right. Well, the original American Constitution did not give the federal government any taxing powers at all.
Yeah.
That was the Articles of Confederation. And we didn't have the income tax until 1913. So from 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, until 1913, we had no income tax. Uh, the constitutional functions of government were funded mostly by tariffs on imports, and these tariffs were called revenue tariffs because the rate, the percentage rate, was thought to be 10 to 15% was enough to raise enough money to finance the constitutional functions of government. But of course, there was always a lot of lobbying and political pressure to fund unconstitutional functions of government with transfer payments. And you need more than just tariffs for that. So in that same year of 1913, we got the Fed to sort of a
Yeah,
legalized
the
counterfeiting
Federal
operation,
Reserve. Yeah, yeah.
Federal Reserve Board, and the income tax. And sure enough, we entered into a world war a couple of years later. Had it not been for that, we would have never been able to enter World War One without the Fed and the income tax.
Yeah.
And in my view, had we not entered World War One, there may even not have even been a World War Two, as far as
Yeah.
that's concerned. But that's speculation. But that's my opinion, and that's kind of what a disaster the income tax was. But yeah, it's like saying, if the government always manufactured shoes and was a shoe monopoly, people would be saying, "Well, how would we get shoes if the government doesn't give us shoes? Where would shoes come from, or anything else?" So yeah, we are used to this income tax system. When Ron Paul was running for the Republican nomination for president several years ago, he made the point that if we abolish the income tax, this was when was it, 2012. He said if we abolish the income tax and replace it with nothing, then the amount of revenue the government would take in would be roughly what it was just about 10 or 12 years earlier. And so, and that's kind of a shocking statistic. Most people
Yeah.
will think, well, the government would dry up and disappear. Not so. And so that's something we need to look at in the future a little more
Yeah.
closely. We need another Ron Paul, in other words.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting talking to economists because their view of the last 100 years of the United States is so much different from what you learn in like surface history books. Because they do talk about the Fed and the boom bust cycles and the financing of the wars and so on. That really the last 100 years, a lot of the problems we had, they have a very strong economic side that people I think are mostly unaware of. You know.
Well, yes, even President Obama's chief economic advisor, when she was an academic, she was known for publishing academic articles in journals showing that uh, there was greater economic instability in America after the Fed was created than there
Yeah.
was before. Things were not perfect before. We had different types of monetary system, but it became more volatile, more boom and bust cycles, more severe recessions, more severe bouts of inflation after the Fed. And of course, the value of the US dollar today is about 4 or 5% of what it was in 1913 in terms of purchasing power. And so it has deflated the value of the purchasing power of the dollar.
Yeah. Another note on kind of history too is I know you're talking about the Whiskey Rebellion, and you were comparing actually this Reduction Act to the Whiskey Rebellion, and that history is very interesting because George Washington himself led the American army to crush the Whiskey Rebellion. That was early American history, and he blamed that on the Democrat societies, which he believed were a threat to the American constitutional republic. He believed that they were anti-constitutional, and they wanted to bring about democracy in America. He saw them as a threat to the basic threat of this country. How does this new Inflation Reduction Act is it similar in any way to the Whiskey Rebellion? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I wrote an op-ed recently that I shared with you that I've sent around.
Yeah.
And when I heard that they wanted to hire 87,000 new IRS agents, I'm an economic historian. I've written several books on economic history as one of my areas of specialization. And in one of my books, I wrote a book on Alexander Hamilton called Hamilton's Curse. And there's a section of that book on the Whiskey Rebellion. And Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled over a new tax on whiskey that was imposed by Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary. They felt discriminated against because there was no tax on tobacco, rice, or other things. There was special tax on other farmers, and they had been distilling a lot of their grain into whiskey. They even used whiskey as currency, as a means of exchange in Western Pennsylvania. And so Hamilton got George Washington to get governors in the surrounding states to round up 13,000 armed men to march into Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And the tax rebels heard about this and all disappeared, and they only were able to apprehend about 20 of them. And George Washington went home. He got tired of the whole thing, and Hamilton was in charge, and he wanted to put them all on trial and hang them. Only two of them were convicted, and George Washington pardoned all of them. That's what happened. And so the Whiskey Rebellion succeeded. The whiskey tax was eventually abolished after Thomas Jefferson became president as a result of the year 1800 election. And this, and so what Hamilton wanted was a standing army of tax collectors. This is why his political opponents, Jefferson and his followers, were very strongly opposed to a standing army. The Constitution itself only allowed in those days for 2 years funding of a standing army. Of course, if you were at war, they could renew the 2 years, but it was only for 2 years. And this is one of the reasons why, because King George III of England, he had a standing army, and it was a standing army of tax collectors who would break into people's homes
Yeah.
to enforce the Stamp Act, which was a tax collection act. And so this push to have almost 90,000 more IRS agents and giving them guns, giving 70,000 of them guns, reminded me of Hamilton's army of tax collectors which was eradicated in the 1790s, but they apparently want to resuscitate it now in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, and if people rebelled over a tax on whiskey, they tax a whole lot more in whiskey these days. I'll tell
That's
you
right.
that.
Yes.
Yeah, overall, though, I mean, what does this mean for America? Like this bill and where it's taking us. What does this mean for the United States?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned before, the sad sack socialists like Bernie Sanders are wringing their hands and wiping their tears that it doesn't go far enough. But it's
Yeah,
probably the most totalitarian piece of legislation that I can recall reading in the 40 years that I've been an academic after completing my PhD in economics in 1979 and teaching at a number of different universities all these years. And it's still not enough for these people. And so either we stop this now or we don't. And if we don't, they will take it as a great victory and go even further so that next year Bernie Sanders won't have to wipe the tears away anymore, and they'll go even further and have an even greener New Deal that brings us further down the road to totalitarian socialism. And one thing that Americans have to wake up to is who these people are. They're not Democrats, they're not liberals, they're not progressives, or they used to call themselves economic Democrats, anything but what they are, totalitarian socialists. And most Americans instinctively are repulsed by that, and they need to wake up.
yeah. Well, I mean, I found it shocking. Even before Obama was elected, a lot of officials would not call themselves socialist. Socialist was a bad word until I think maybe 2009 to 2000. Until Obama, socialist was a bad word. Politicians would not call themselves that. And it's crazy that in such a short amount of time it could become so widely accepted among the left.
Yeah, I think it's because of several generations of political correctness in the universities. I used to teach a course in an economics program that I taught in called Capitalism and Its Critics. And I would have the students read some pro capitalist literature and then the Communist Manifesto and then go back and forth with who I consider the good guys and then the bad guys. And one of the things I did is I had the class read parts of this book written by these French authors on the history of communism in, uh, in all of the brutality and the death and destruction. And there was a an author at the University of Hawaii named Rummel, R.J. Rummel, who wrote a book called Death by Government. That's a very depressing type of research. It was an accounting of how many people communist governments killed, murdered their own people, not by war, but by murdering their own people in the 20th century. And one of my students was the president of young campus Republicans, college Republicans. And on a day where they would be out on the quad recruiting students to their group, he had copied one of the pages that listed the death count under communism, Russia, China, elsewhere, in Vietnam. And he told me that not one student who walked by knew anything at all about this. They had no idea that a single person was killed by any communist government anywhere in history, even though these were 19 and 20-year-old college students whose parents were sending them to a $50,000 or $60,000 a year school. And we've had that going on for several generations now. So it's not surprising at all to me that the millions of younger people who are polled by opinion polls have said maybe 50% of them they prefer socialism over capitalism.
Yeah, well, you talk about disinformation, about the diseducation of the American youth, right?
Yes.
Now, Thomas, again, tell us about your book. You have an upcoming book, the Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. Tell us briefly about that. Where can people find it?
It's part of a long series of Regnery Publishers. They have a politically incorrect guide series, some 30 of them. And this is my contribution to that series.
Hmm.
And it's about how there's always been a great bias toward government intervention in the field of economics, There's always been a lot of economists who are basically government propagandists who tell stories about the failures of economic freedom and the success of socialism and government planning. And my book explains what I consider to be the true story and not that story.
Great. Hey, Thomas DiLorenzo, thanks so much for being on Crossroads. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me on. Take care.